to the Truth in Data podcast, where each episode we dig into a different digital forensics topic. This week's topic, something really important, bias. I'm Jessica.
I'm Kim.
And I'm Debbie.
And I know some of you are probably like, oh, AI. We're going to pause on the AI part of the conversation because there's lots of other implications of bias in digital forensics. So I want to start with other areas of digital forensics. And let's start with some human factors of bias. Um, and I will say that one thing I really like is that we do have a system that hopefully allows for both people to have representation in digital forensics. So, Kim, I'll start with you. Do you think that the scope of an investigation affects the bias of the investigation? Or how does it?
I think it can. And I think that for this moment, let's kind of separate out the quote investigative part
Sure.
apart from the examination portion.
We're just
Uh,
speaking about digital forensics examination. Good clarification.
yes. So from that perspective, I feel like that. Let's say, for example, that you had an examination that was brought to you, and you were given a lot of background on the investigation, and there could be portions that you've been told quote everything, maybe you've only been told a portion of what has occurred or what is going on with the case, and maybe you've been told nothing, right? Maybe you've been told very little, and maybe all that you have to go on is just what documentation that you have through affidavits, search warrants, things along those lines. Hopefully you've been given some good information, but this is where I feel like uh, a really good place for a bias to get started, just in the information that an examiner is given.
Hmm. Well, what do you mean by that? How does the information bias? Does the lack of information bias? Does the fact? What do you mean by that?
I think so. I think either the lack of information that you're given, um, it could be the amount of information that you're given, or whomever has submitted that to you may have their own thoughts about what you might actually be able to find, or what you need to look for.
For sure, for sure. I totally agree. Debbie, what are your thoughts on this same concept of how the what is delivered to the examiner by whoever? Well, we're in this instance we're talking about law enforcement, so we'll stick with this side
Right.
to begin with, and then we'll talk about the inverse. How does the way that the investigation is framed to the examiner affect bias?
Well, so many times say you've got a mobile phone, digital devices that are seized by an investigator, turned in to an examiner, and a lot of times what intake is a form that they are required to complete, and they fill out certain information. And if they have their own biases, if they're talking about look for certain information, that can almost lead one to believe, oh, they're looking for, that could be biased in and of itself.
100%.
If they are, whatever information is put on that form, a lot of times on our forms we would say, tell us just a little bit about the case and a little bit about what you're looking for. That in and of itself, if the investigator has bias already about maybe a suspect, or maybe how someone died, or like, there can be bias in the information that the investigator is given simply off of a form, off of what they're asked to provide and what they're not asked to provide. We say that give the examiner as much information as possible so that they sort of know what to look for, but then that can also cause bias.
Well, there's a couple of important parts here though, right? Because there's a difference between the information that's given and the scope can sometimes, in my experience, introduce bias in itself because you're not allowed to look for external factors. And I think this is what it's important around how we handle minimization of digital evidence. Let's start with the fact that for people's privacy, and for it does make sense to have a scope of an investigation. Now, the good thing in an adversarial system is that we're not just reliant upon, hopefully we're not just reliant upon the analysis of the digital forensics examiner who's working for the prosecution, often law enforcement, that we also have the digital forensics examiner who works for the defense. Hopefully they have access to one. I understand that that is not true in all jurisdictions or in all places, and that there is cost issues and different jurisdictions deal with that differently, and not everybody gets access to their own examiner. And I do understand that in certain jurisdictions around the world that you may be a third party neutral expert, just like a DNA person may be considered. At the end of the day, because of scope limitations, depending on how minimization of digital evidence is handled, and there's a great paper on minimization of digital evidence from SWIG-DE, or the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence, it means that the examiner may not be able to access information for the prosecution that could infer the opposite. In other words, they can only look for the thing. They can't look for everything that is opposite that thing, because the data set needs to be minimized so that they don't see things they shouldn't see. And this is intentional. Again, this is about people's privacy. However, that's why I think an adversarial system is the most important thing to support that, is that people have a right to defense. And that really goes to the ability of, when we minimize data, we shouldn't minimize some jurisdictions, and certain precedent sometimes says you can only have access to the data from this time frame from this particular database. But the problem is that will prevent you from looking at data that isn't parsed by commercial tools, right? So what isn't parsed, what artifacts are there that aren't supported, doesn't allow you to necessarily look at system of artifacts, doesn't allow you to necessarily correlate artifacts across. And what do I mean by correlating artifacts? The example I like to give is if you say, okay, you can only look at, we're going to make up a chatting application. Let's say you can only look at Chat Me Up from November 1st to November 5th of 2025. And if you can only look at that time period and that application, how do you then correlate the GUID with Chat Me Up to the contacts database for the phone, which will give you the name or a contextual element? How do you then view the attachments if you're only allowed to go to that database? Are you allowed to look at the media zero, portion of, let's say, an Android device, where maybe live pictures that were taken in that app may be? So I think that scope can really have an impact on, depending on how a jurisdiction does minimization of data, on someone's ability to do the question. I do think it's the forensics examiner's responsibility to be, if the statement is, Johnny killed Sally with a candlestick in the ballroom, to disprove each one of those elements. Is it possible that Johnny did not kill Sally? Is it possible that it was not with a candlestick? And is it possible that it wasn't in the ballroom? So you have to look for the things of, well, could it be? So then you have to rephrase your other questions that you're asking of the evidence. Was there anyone else who was there? Was there anyone, and I'm obviously not talking in digital evidence, I'm talking in the game of Clue. Were there any other weapons that are available? And are there any other rooms that Sally, who's now the deceased, might have been in? Or what other rooms might she have been in? And maybe was her body brought to the ballroom? Just because her body is in the ballroom and just because the candlestick's there doesn't mean it wasn't with the rope in the billiard room. So, I feel like it's our responsibility to ask the inverse question, which is often what the defense does, but it is really important that we do it. How do you think examiners respond to pressure to answer the question that's being asked by the investigator or the prosecutor?
So I think that one of the challenges that we have, obviously, is time. I think that because with all of the backlogs and all of the they're trying to get to the next case, it it would be very, I think, unfortunately, very common for them to answer the questions that they were asked and move on to the next case. Mm-hmm. And because of what you have just said, mm-hmm. that's, gosh, there could be so many things wrong with that. But I can see it happening. Answer the questions that we were asked, move on to the next case.
So how do we do, oh, sorry, Kim.
But I think that's a huge challenge. I mean, along the lines of, workflows and of backlogs in terms of, okay, let's answer this question and then let's move it along. So then let's say, what if you do answer that question and you quote, move your examination along, you tell them it's finished, they pick up their reports and they go on their merry way. And then a year, 2, 12 years later, it goes to court. And then now all of a sudden you're needing to answer some more questions. So, and that ends up being another question.
Well, but that's the thing too, right? Like ethically, I can't exceed my scope. If I'm told only to look at this thing, I can't exceed that scope. So it needs to be really clear, and really it needs to be a conversation that happens. And I think what I've seen is more experienced examiners are much more comfortable having that conversation than less experienced examiners, who sometimes think that the question means that there's already other knowledge of this, right?
Well, I think you're talking about two things. The scope of the search warrant, yes.
Oh, yes.
But what they have asked for,
those
what the investigator have asked for, are sort of can be two different things.
Well, those are two different things on the law enforcement side.
Right. Okay.
On the, if you're hired as an external expert, you still you can only stick within the scope of what you've been hired to do, right? So it depends on your role in an investigation. Now, again, on the defense side, you may have much more leeway or to do whatever you need to do in support of that case, because but presuming that you've been given full access to the evidence. Because if you're just given something like a portable case or a reader review, those are just contextual outputs from tools, and that should never be the basis of any investigation. That is bias.
I want to make one point going back just a little bit, that when we're talking about the scope of the search warrant and sort of categorized extractions based on the search warrant, I do think that if law enforcement, if you're in a jurisdiction where this is common, where they're going to sort of bookend what you can look at, whether it's what type of artifacts you can extract and look at, whether it's a time frame, I do think it's important to educate the judges inside of the search warrant and include language as to why you need to look at more than just this time frame or more than just these artifacts. I get it that a judge is like, no, you just need images, text messages, contacts, emails. Like, I understand from their perspective that they are protecting someone's privacy, but I think it's our responsibility to include language to educate them that might not be the best option for finding the truth.
So one of the things I like about the SWGDE papers is there's a paper about there's two separate papers. There's one about minimization of digital evidence, and then there's one on, I'll have to find that one, on basically what you're saying, and it might be a NIST OSEC paper. I actually don't remember which way it came out. This is a problem with being on multiple boards, but there is a paper also about the ethical consideration of precisely this, right? Of ensuring that
categorized extraction.
No, not specifically of categorized. So the minimization requirements for quality assurance and the processing of digital media evidence, that's an old one. Then there's the minimization guidelines. But then there is a newer paper. I'll have to find it. I'll make sure I put it in the show notes. There's a newer paper about specifically the ethics and privacy concerns. And it's good because you can use those two papers in balance with each other, kind of showing that. So I'm just making a note to myself to make sure I get that. All right.
I think also that this kind of goes back to, I think every episode we keep going back to this, but it goes back to communication. You have to, whomever, accepts that examination, accepts that statement of work, whatever, on whichever side that you're on wherever that is, there needs to be a good conversation, because that point that everything is fresh on folks' mind, most likely, that they're able to explain to you what they need, and maybe they don't know how to explain it well on a form. Maybe they don't know how to write it well in our uh,
Language.
type of terms
Yeah.
for us to understand exactly what they're saying. So I feel like that's a huge part of it. And that also, there are some laboratories that, when someone brings an examination, there's an intake person who has absolutely zero to do with the examination.
Yep.
This may just be an evidence intake person, and
Mm-hmm.
they're just accepting it. They're, filling out the chain of custody. They're making sure that all the paperwork's in line, and then it goes into the evidence room, and then it goes into a queue in order to be assigned to someone. Even if that's the case, then whenever the examiner is assigned the case, then that is a good opportunity to touch base with the investigator, double check what it is that they're needing, and
Yes.
even if
Have a conversation.
yeah, even if they had a conversation whenever there was an intake moment, then still have a conversation if it's been any amount of time, because there's so much, as we've talked about in numerous situations, there's so much that goes into an investigation, Debbie, as you're
Mm-hmm.
well aware, that we as the examiner, we're only playing a small part. There's so many things that's happening there that's going on that we don't know unless we either ask or someone voluntarily tells us. So that's important for us to keep in mind, is that, as I think we said in another episode, this isn't just about the examiner. There's a lot that's going on here.
So one of the other points I want to bring up, and there's actually an interesting paper on this that was just came out in March of 2025 in Forensic Science International Digital Investigations, which is one of the premier academic journals in our field. And it was titled Tool Induced Bias, Misleading Data Presentation as a Biasing Source in Digital Forensics Analysis. And what this paper goes on to talk about is that there's actually three areas in which they did a test data set that they sent out to several practitioners. They had it processed with two specific tools. What the tools were, I think, is irrelevant to this conversation, but it's in the paper if you want to look it up. And what they did was they identified bias in the performance of everyone who took this test based on certain criteria that they analyzed the participants' results in, and they for each one of these areas they looked at it for they did the tool miss the trace. I'm sorry, did the tool miss the trace? Was there a misleading representation by the tool, or did the examiner make a mistake? And I have an issue with this study, which is the reason I want to bring it up. And the issue isn't to how the study was done. The issue is to the concept that a tool misses a trace. Because here's the deal. The tool's job is to run an algorithm of something they've figured out. It is the examiner's responsibility to validate it. It is the examiner's responsibility to test. This is a large onus, and going to Debbie's problem, this is not something that can be done on every case. Debbie's point, right? If a case is pleading out, that may be a problem. And the whole concept, it may not be a problem because we'll never get to this, but maybe somebody's only pleading out because they think the evidence is so stacked against them. And it is only so stacked against them because it was presented with a bias on how the query and search was done, that the evidence in their favor is not being presented to them. And they're unaware, right? The average citizen doesn't know how data is stored on their phone, so they don't know how it could be possibly examined at their behest and find information that may support their defense. So I think that it's really interesting. So, but I do understand the study. I'm saying that I don't think the study was flawed. I'm saying it's something that as an examiner, I take as our onus, not the tool's onus. But there's these three factors, and this one of misleading presentation I have particular concern with. And this is a lot of times I think what happens when a non-examiner looks at tool results and makes an assumption about something. Just we'll do something simple. Just because the picture existed on the device that maybe the user accessed that picture, which we know just because a picture exists on a device, you still have to show access, you still have to show attribution, right? Because something could be part of, I don't know, it could be an icon set that came down, not a nefarious picture. They don't have nefarious pictures and icon sets, but you know, the picture of the moon may not have been the person taking a picture of the moon. It might have been a moon that was included in a data set. Um, so those types of things are really important. What are your thoughts, each of you, on how tools play into bias?
Well, I mean, as you just said, tools are there to help us, and I think that putting too or reading too much into what the tool displays, or even some tools in how things are labeled, may even make examiners have a particular, or not even examiners, let's even say the investigator, if they come to maybe look at,
Mm-hmm.
maybe if you say, hey, sit down and look at this with me.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe when they look at it, then that's making them, or if they have, some type of a, portable type of extraction that they've received, then maybe the way things are labeled are making them sort of fill in some blanks that don't need to be filled in that way. And sometimes you can't tell the whole story. We're asked to paint the picture, right? We're not always asked to find the one picture. We're asked to paint the entire picture oftentimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is one thing. And just depending on a tool, is that there are, and or any tool really, the whole investigation or whole examination in general, is that there are going to oftentimes be gaps in that story, or be gaps in that whole timeline. Maybe, I mean, there's not going to be everything that you're going to be able to explain or to be able to attribute to a particular place. Maybe you can at times, and maybe you can do that for the important parts, but every single tiny thing, oftentimes you're going to find out that there are some places that have blanks, and people tend to fill in the blanks with what they think is supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say there's another interesting point of tool bias that you just kind of touched on, but it reminded me of, which is a lot of times an examiner will run two tools and then say, or many tools, and say these tools agree without questioning. They're assuming that they're different, right? Without questioning, are both of these tools using the same underlying code? We find a lot of times that two tools they may have all taken some open source code on how to parse something, or all read the same blog or academic paper or even a peer reviewed paper on how to parse something, and all went and built parsing support for it. So I think that sometimes we say, oh, well, I ran it through two tools, so now I have everything. Well, you need to be able to articulate why the tools are different, but also why they're the same. What about testing bias? So then we say the appropriate thing is to dig into the data and test. What kind of bias can be introduced in testing, and how do we deal with bias in our testing?
I think that's I think that's tough when you're doing your testing, to try to not have bias, because if you are looking at some data, let's say within your examination, into the evidence that you're looking at, and then that leads you to say, this is where I need to look at this particular data. That then, if you're going to try to test, then go to replicate that data, then you're going to have to take a few steps yourself in order to try to make some of that happen and occur. So that means you're kind of taking a little bit of a leap yourself in order to do that.
Right. So a lot of times when people test for a specific scenario, they go, can what I presume happened cause this artifact to be here? And then they go, yes, so therefore the artifact is here for that reason. But the more important thing to test is what else can cause that artifact. And you have to look at how things operate and then test all of these different methodologies. David Cowan used to have a fantastic couple of episodes as part of the Forensic Lunch called the Forensic Test Kitchen. And he would do live testing of different artifacts and trying to figure out well, what if I open this from a command prompt? And what if it's an admin prompt? And what if instead, and I'm giving a Windows here based example, and what if instead I run that command from PowerShell? Does that affect where the artifact is stored? What's the difference between if I do this on Windows 11 or Windows 10? What's the difference between what the user has access to? So just a variety of what's the difference between if I create this file in by a command or if I create this file on the desktop. What's the difference between if I right click or if I, and all of these different scenarios in terms of, how does it affect what is stored where? And the truth is we need to write a really robust testing plan when we're doing testing. The NIST Foundation's paper speaks to this, the which is a fantastic resource. The there's a document, the Dataset Generation Guidelines from the NIST OSAC speak to this, but there really is an area for improvement here in terms of ensuring people are testing for removal of biases, because a lot of times the way that I've discovered new artifacts is because something didn't make sense, right? And so a lot of times we just have to go, hey, this doesn't make sense. Why? And also not, we shouldn't be making, in my opinion, you shouldn't want just correlating and corroborating pieces of evidence, right? Again, just because a picture exists doesn't mean it was viewed by the user or even put there by the user, right? It is our responsibility to demonstrate that, or demonstrate it wasn't, or be honest, which is the most important part in your reporting, and saying we don't know that factor, and that's really important.
Yeah, that's what we've talked about on several occasions and several different things that we've been doing, especially as of late, is that, you may not know every single detail and every single portion. And especially when you're talking about maybe the subsets of data that you are being narrowed down to work with. There are going to be, not maybe, there are going to be times, that you will not be able to answer all those questions. You aren't going to be able to paint the picture. You just can't, because you're just not going to have all of those answers. And that's where you do have to just say that I don't know, or you just have to, explain there may be something that could answer that question. However, that's not something that I had access to for this. And that's where you just have to stay within the lane that you've been given.
Absolutely, right? And speaking to your experience and broadly testing and trying to figure out what causes what, and just giving yourself the opportunity to challenge your bias. And I think that's it. I think if something's going to court or you're writing a report, that you should be asking yourself, what else could have caused this? What else could this mean? And I think if we asked ourselves that, and the biggest thing is, to me, was I did like this statement in this paper I was mentioning, because it talks about that misleading presentation, and that's really around that the tool category or its subcategory or the naming convention inferred something that may have been confusing. So this could be misunderstanding what causes a timestamp. This could be here's the big one, lack of data, right? And being confused by the fact that there may be data that surrounds that data, and going, well, the lack of data means that data didn't happen. It could be a misunderstanding. A good example is Safari history on iOS. Kim, I think you know exactly where I'm going, which is if you have a logical extraction, Safari history is only going to give you 30 days of history. However, you will see timestamps that are before that 30 days. And that's because if a website never falls out of a 30-day viewing, it's always been continually accessed in 30 days, it will have dates going back outside of that because it still maintains its history of dates. But it's just that search that has also been searched in the last 30 days. So sometimes people will go, okay, so let's say we're in December of 2025 and we're looking at Safari history, but we see hits back in June. And so we say, well, our person, we've got the Safari history in June because we see hits. And our person never looked up how to run a washing machine. They never Googled how to run a washing machine. And so then what happens is that there's this assumption that because it doesn't exist there, that it wasn't searched. And that's a fallacy. It could not exist there for numerous reasons. In this instance, how the Safari history database works. And what's the problem with testing that? You can't test it at once. If you were to test that immediately, right, you would meet your assumption because anything you tested, you actually have to go outside a 30-day window with your test data to discover that. So,
and to do several different actions to test it.
Correct. And to delete some things and not delete others, and get different types of extraction so you can see the difference between how that appears in a logical, how it appears in a file system, making sure that you have the right test device. So there absolutely can be a bias in the way we test, but there also can be a bias from the way that evidence appears to us based on our experience in general with evidence, and not asking the question, well, is this data missing for a reason? So lack of data is always a weirdness. Assumptions about existence of data and what causes something to... There's the other thing, deleted data. There's a lot of bias with deletions, that just because if we have evidence that something used to exist in a data structure and that it no longer exists, I think there's an inherent bias to say that the user made that action when you need to test that artifact, because systems remove data from differing data structures at differing intervals and regularity dependent on the way they're programmed.
Yep. The data just rolls off sometimes without any type of a user interaction with it, or anything that the user initiated, or anything that they necessarily tried to do. And yes, and the indication that something's been deleted, you're gonna need to again do some testing, figure out what could make that appear as though that it has been, quote, deleted.
I am going to refer, I hate the term deleted. I am going to refer to the standardization of file recovery paper. Full disclaimer, I'm a co-author of that, but Dr. Owen Casey and Dr. Alex Nelson, fantastic paper. I like to call it the Why You Should Never Say Deleted paper, but I do think there is a bias there. Now, that said, these are all different types of biases. There is also the newest tool bias, which is IA. Oh my gosh. Information assurance now presents tool bias. Artificial intelligence, a lot of it brought by generative AI and large language models, giving the separation that AIs existed before. What are your thoughts on how that affects bias?
I mean, really how the models are trained, so, having, I don't know how LLMs are trained, so, but training them properly using data sets, using a variety of data sets.
Yep.
I think that would help mitigate bias.
100%. And biased data sets can have to do with when you search for data to train with, what data do you get access to? And that could happen because of geolocation. It could happen because of cultural things. If I were, making an imagery for, what it looks like for whiteboards, let's say we're making an AI to detect whiteboards, and all of my pictures of writing on whiteboards is in English, is it possible that I might not be able to pick up a whiteboard that has Mandarin on it? Yeah, because the model might infer that English characters, be it script or written, is part of what defines this as being part of the data if I didn't include whiteboards that had other languages written on them, or if I didn't include whiteboards that had pictures drawn on them, or if I didn't include newer whiteboards, which are electronic whiteboards that we write on with pens. So I agree on that. What about there's a couple of tools now that have introduced the concept of natural language querying of the tool, which is I go to the tool and I literally write, can you show me, and in English, not searching, not understanding the artifacts, not applying a filter, can you show me any conversations about rhubarb? How does that affect bias?
Well, one, the way that I may word a question, the way you may word a question, it's a couple of different things.
Exactly, yep.
That's the big one, I feel like. And because again, how what is it actually in tune to hear and to listen for?
Mm-hmm.
What is it expecting? What does it anticipate? And yeah, I mean, I'm from the country and you're a city girl. We talk way
We
differently
talk
whenever we
different.
so we're probably going to ask questions differently. Also, some people, I feel like that they get into a habit if they're asking questions, like within a computer where they narrow it down,
Right.
even like with your search engines or things like that. Oftentimes you narrow things down and then you may expand it some. So not just how it is asked, but what you put in it, in the how it's asked, and how much detail. I mean, there is a lot that can go into that can determine what your results are going to be.
Oh, yeah, there's also this theory that AI, large language models, they like to please. So they like to give you an answer. Even if, and I'm not saying this of any specific forensics tool, I'm saying studies that have been done on large language models, even if it's fictitious. And I think we all have examples where we found fictitious data. Gemini at one point said I was the founder of SANS. I am not the founder of SANS. My bank account would prove that. But but it's because the AI in writing a bio of me was trying to please me, I guess, or trying to put together things that it has. We've seen AI make up fake references, etc. Not saying it would do this in a forensics tool, but I think you're right, got it right. The way the question is phrased introduces bias. And then there is additional bias that is introduced by the thought that the response to the question is all that there is. And that can only work amongst what that tool knows of artifacts. It doesn't expand to other artifacts. And again, the tool doesn't do testing. Tools parse algorithms. Tools are nothing more than algorithms looking for data based on an algorithm. They cannot tell you the meaning of an artifact. If they can, we're out of jobs because that's our job.
That is our job.
Well, I guess there's a lot for examiners to consider when it comes to bias in the way that they conduct themselves in their examinations, and that it's something that really should be considered and hopefully is being taught in labs. That's a really big, important part.
Hopefully.
Well, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.